Just then, a Canaanite woman approached Jesus and started shouting, "My daughter is tormented. Lord, Son of David, have mercy on me." The story of Joseph meeting his brothers could have gone a very different way. You know the story of what happened to Joseph. He was reviled by his brother because he was the dreamer. He was the one who had the vivid imagination, the connection to God. God spoke to Joseph through his dreams. And worse than that, he was the favored son. And so the brothers, they were threatened by this. They were jealous of it. It was too much against what they thought was to be expected. That they took him and they said, "Let us kill this dreamer." And they threw him into the pit. And then they either thought better of it or they simply saw potential profit in it. And so they saw traders coming down the road and they drew him out and then sold Joseph into slavery. So that's the story we know. And in the passage today, Joseph is reunited with his brothers. But oh, how that story could have gone differently. Joseph went from being the one with the least power, the one thrown into the pit and left for dead, to a position of power. Joseph suddenly had gotten through his dreams, through his visions, through the favor of God, and through the favor and attention of Pharaoh. Joseph had risen to a very high position in Egypt. Indeed, his foresight and his visions had been what allowed Egypt to survive this terrible famine that they were going through. And that was the reason, of course, why Joseph's brothers had now traveled in search of food, having no idea that the man who had made all of that possible was the brother that they had thrown away and left for dead. Through his dreams, Joseph rose to a position of power. Joseph is such a curious figure. He's someone who, in a way, pioneered both the fields of dream interpretation and risk management, as he saw both fat years and thin years and knew what it meant to set aside for the bad years that were coming. So when he met with his brothers, he was a man of great power. He had status. Presumably, he had wealth. He had the ear of the Pharaoh and presumably any number of other powerful people in the kingdom. Perhaps more than that, he had insider knowledge. Because he lived and walked in the halls of power and because he receives visions and knew what was going to come. It would be so easy to plan for hardship if we dreamed about it in advance, wouldn't it? Well, Joseph did. And so that gave him an incredible measure of power over his brothers. So he could have acted very differently when he saw them. And before we simply retell the story, remember what it's like to be wounded by people who you love. That sting of rejection, especially if it's people in your own family, can last our whole lives. And so many of us wouldn't be surprised if Joseph decided that comeuppance was what was due, and not only ignored them, perhaps even sent people to cast those brothers out of the country, to let them go and fare for themselves, right? Turnabout is fair play. Well, Joseph didn't do that. But it didn't have to be malice. He could have simply acted out of self-preservation. These were the brothers who had thrown him aside. And suddenly, all that he had gained in his life may be in jeopardy if he lets them back in, if he lets them see who he is and who he's become. Because so often, those people who are closest to us, when they come and see what our lives have become threatened once again, just as they were when he was a younger man. And so perhaps, even out of self-preservation, he could have declined to help his brothers. But that's not what happens, and we know that. The minute he sees them, his heart leaps with what I'm sure is a mixture of joy and sadness at all that has gone on between them. But the biggest thing was a desire, a hunger to embrace them and reveal himself to his brothers. And as a gesture of love to say, this is who I am, and I'm going to help you, and I want to help our Father as well. His heart takes over, and through his tears, you almost forget about this wound, this terrible thing that they had done to him. He seems to have forgotten, or at least he casts it aside so that he can care for them in their hour of need. Now, this is a textbook example of mercy. Mercy. Showing compassion and forgiveness when it's in one's power to choose whether to do so or not to do so. Joseph seems to not even think about it. Unselfconsciously, he reaches out and embraces his brother. I love that the savior of the Egyptian economy in this moment is led entirely by his heart. I also love how this redefines family. This act of casting their brother aside, a terrible act of violence and selfishness, could have been of their lives. And up to that point, I think it very much was. But we can think of that hole that they threw him into as a kind of wound, a wound in the earth that for generations would have defined each of their lives. That would have been the singular event, the most important thing in any of their lives, something absolutely wretched. There'd be no story told apart from it. But Joseph transforms it. He transfigures it through this act of mercy, replacing that terrible, violent, awful story, heartbreaking, replacing it with a story of even greater power, one of compassion and love, forgiveness. Mercy fills that hole with fertile soil. Mercy is how we dissolve barriers. And Lord knows we have so many barriers in our lives. Barriers that keep others out. Barriers that keep us inside our own walls. When Jesus meets the Canaanite woman in the gospel passage this morning, once again, a textbook example, in this case, of someone who is an outsider. If you can imagine border walls, this is someone who would be on the outside in just about every way that you can imagine. She was a Gentile. She was a woman, so she was limited in terms of what she was supposed to say. Her daughter, she approached Jesus to say, Lord, have mercy, my daughter is being tormented by a demon. So, by virtue of even that happening to her daughter, that couldn't have been good for her status. And of course, what does she do? She follows Jesus and the disciples. She shouts at them. She is not polite. She does not demur. She does not follow the rules of propriety as she reaches out to Jesus. I think we could say that she was behaving in a manner most uppity. And of course, she was a Canaanite, meaning she was one of those people whose ancestors were cast aside when the Israelites arrived in this land. So in every way you can imagine, she is outside the tribe. And even Jesus in this passage, his first response is actually not to help her, which is shocking to all of us. It certainly is to me just a little bit every single time I read it. Because Jesus says, no, my ministry is to the people of God's own family. But we're back, here we are once again, expanding our very idea of what family is and who is in God's family. And in this case, it takes an act of mercy. Actually, to be more precise, it takes a request for mercy from someone who is outside the very boundaries that even Jesus seems to be working in right now. And what does she say? She says, Lord, help me. Lord, help me. Last week, we told the story of Peter getting out of the boat and walking to Jesus. And as he begins to sink, as the storms are raging, and he is afraid not just of falling on his face, but of drowning, what does he say as he falls into the water? Lord, help me. The exact same words that this woman whose daughter is tormented cries out, Lord, help me. How many times have we said this in our own lives? When we've cried ourselves to sleep at night, when we haven't known how we were going to get through the crisis that we are in the midst of, whether it was something acute, a terrible illness, or something that we're like what we're going through right now, apart from one another, uncertain of our future, uncertain of how we'll get through it. All we can say, Lord, help me. Lord, have mercy. Now, sometimes folks can be threatened by the very idea that Jesus changes in the midst of the story. Because from the beginning to the end of the story, Jesus goes through a certain transformation himself. He starts by saying, I am here for the people of my own family, my own community, to serve the Jewish people. But she says, Lord, have mercy. She cries from outside the wall and says, you have within your power to help me and to help my daughter. And Jesus, in the words of one scholar, is big enough not to be ashamed to learn something. Jesus is big enough not to be ashamed to learn something. I think we can all listen to that. Can we all be big enough not to be ashamed, to be challenged, to learn, to reach beyond our comfort zone, and to be merciful, to care for those in great need? And through mercy, Jesus' ministry changes. This is one of the great leaps into the wider world. And the story all throughout the New Testament is the story, the message, the person of Jesus leaping farther and farther and farther, expanding to draw all of us into the family of God, each and every one of us. Lord, have mercy. Mercy is an essential quality of God. It's something we receive when we say, Lord, help us. But when we say that God is merciful, we are actually making a rich theological statement about the very nature of God. It's a kind of miniature creed in the midst of our deepest painful moments. To show, and it is also a call on us, to show and to practice mercy is to participate in the very holiness of God. To turn from the settling of scores, to refuse to be defined by our wounds, and to instead let mercy be our vanguard. To say that God is merciful, though, is also a profound statement of witness. To name that God is merciful, to set our hearts on that, is also to name the unholiness and harm that occurs when we fail to show mercy. Whether in our own personal lives, the story of Joseph tells us, among other things, that mercy begins at home. It's something we teach to our children. It's something we model and learn within our communities of faith. But it is wider than that. As a people, as a nation, as a culture, as a community, as a church, we must continually ask ourselves, is mercy a part of who we are? Is mercy a core value? Do we let that call to mercy disrupt our ego needs and assumptions about how the world works? Do we let compassion and kindness reshape our hardened hearts? And this is a part of the daily journey. We all know this, that one of the temptations that we have daily is to let our hearts continue to harden, whether it's around wounds, whether it's around assumptions, whether it's around the need for power and prestige. Yet we also have to every day be looking, how can we soften these hearts that God has given us? to become receptors of the very holiness of God. And so often we withhold mercy because we think those barriers serve us. But those walls only lock us in. They trap us in the same holes in the ground into which Joseph's brothers threw him. But mercy is the ladder with which we climb out. Mercy is the means by which we offer compassion and forgiveness, dissipates our needs to settle scores, and breaks down the walls that separate us one from another. Through mercy, we participate in the holy movement of God. Through God's mercy, we are carried through times of trouble and restored to wholeness. Joseph had all the power in the world. Yet when he sees his brothers, he lets his heart take over and he embraces them. And that embrace has the power to transform the stinging memory of what they had done to him. That embrace drew its very power from the pit, from that act of violence, but it transfigured it, drawing the pain and violence from the ground and cleansing it, giving their relationship a new defining story. This is the work of compassion and forgiveness, the work of mercy through which God heals our peoples, our families, our nations. Lord, have mercy. That cry for help is also a hymn of praise. Through it, our hearts reach out to God for healing and forgiveness. When we show mercy, we are not simply imitating God or even giving back a little of what God has given us. When we embrace our sisters and brothers, whether we do that to feed them or to dispel demons or simply to welcome them home, we are setting out sails to catch the winds of the Spirit. This is when we share in the very holiness of God.